The design of the 6-pounder to replace the 2-pounder was basically sealed in 1939 after construction of the prototype, but they never really entered production. It wasn't until November of 41 that the 6-pounder really started leaving the lines and hitting the field. Such was the demand for any gun right now that the factories couldn't afford to stop producing 2-pounders to retool to the new gun. Thus it was that a full year before the 6-pounder hit the field, in November of 1940, the process was started for developing the replacement for the 6-pounder. A couple of design studies later, and they concluded that a 3-inch weapon, 17-pounder, would be the best choice. And despite the director of artillery being, quote, a bit perturbed at the massiveness of the gun, an order for a prototype was placed in July of 41. It wasn't until May of 42 that the prototypes really started coming off the line, and a couple of tweaks were still necessary. It was autumn of 42 before they started hitting the field. 29th of September 42, it was concluded that, this gun might actually be a little bit too big to be lugged around cross-country by lorries or manhandled by personnel. So an order was placed to develop a self-propelled mounting for the 17-pounder. It was thought that this would be filled by the A30, but they also realized that the A30 was an entirely new design on a new chassis. There might be some teething problems, so in the meantime, let's make a stopgap. And for that stopgap, they picked the infantry tank Mark III. As a result, the vehicle was officially designated 17-pounder self-propelled mount on Valentine. It was later given the more common name of Archer, and thus begins to fork between the ecclesiastical names that the Royal Artillery were giving, such as the Priest for the 105 or the Deacon for the self-propelled 6-pounder anti-tank, and the A names for anti-tank vehicles. We are at the Tank Museum in Bovington, and we're going to take a quick tour around their Archer. The first question, of course, is always, which end is front? Well, the manual answers this for you. It's the front end. The manual also describes the vehicle as providing a mobile heavy anti-tank gun on low silhouette on a chassis which uses components of the transmission of the Valentine tank, which is a bit more accurate than simply saying it is based on a Valentine hull, as an inspection of both the infantry tank and the SPAT gun will show you. Note also use of the term anti-tank gun. This is not a tank destroyer. It was crewed by Royal Artillery and used in the same roles as the towed AT gun. It was just a bit trickier to hide. Starting the tour of the vehicle at the front slope, the original prototype actually had a pike nose where the two plates met here in a sort of a triangle, but the production vehicles replaced this with a flat panel in the middle upon which you will find your spare track links. Further up you have the visor that the driver could use to look out in low threat environments. It was officially known as a lookout. Now frankly, I'm having some difficulty trying to envision a high threat environment because one would have thought that gun towards enemy would be the default. The armour is a moderately sloped 20mm, and interestingly, the armour is indeed in metric in the manual, but being a British vehicle, everything else is in imperial measurements. Further down we got the standard two clevises, mounting points for clevises, and a tow hook would be mounted here as well, which I have to assume would be for short range recovery or emergency use. The manual shows that the tow cable would be mounted around these parts along the tow hook and back up along these hooks here. You'll see this large case here is for a number 2 Mark 7 rangefinder. The smaller little one to the side is for a radio antenna. Just below on the right would be a methyl bromide fire extinguisher for the engine compartment, and you could often find a carbon tetrachloride extinguisher mounted on the rangefinder case for all other fires. A second fire extinguisher will be inside with the commander. At the very bottom of the front hull is a little drain plug, and that is the way that you get out all the water that has inevitably gotten into your vehicle. There is no roof after all. A service light will be on one side, a blackout light would be on the other. There are also some marker lights. And finally, you'll see the serial number begins with the traditional S of the British Army for self-propelled gun. The suspension, well, it's Carden's bright idea again, the slow motion type. I've went over this a little bit before on the A10, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, although I will note the addition of a return roller in between the two bogies. There are a couple of minor changes on this version. For example, the tires are now molded onto the wheels, and the tracks have now become a single pin type. The advantages of the slow motion suspension was actually quite good at slow speeds, and it was very easy to repair. You simply unbolt the bogie and change it out. Plus, it did not take up any space inside the vehicle. Yes, everybody's favorite track tension, and on this vehicle, it appears to be a right pain. Note I am lying on the ground under the vehicle, and usually you will not be doing this on dry concrete indoors. The manual is not specific quite how this is done, but it does say that you have to release the locking nut on the pawl here. You then push the pawl up, which releases the ratchet on the tooth. Once that is done, you can then insert the adjuster tool and lever backwards or forwards. Now, to tighten it's a little bit simple. You don't have to worry with this. You just put the tool in, lever, and the ratchet will just lock it in place. The manual is not specific as to just how tight it needs to be. It just states that there must be no appreciable sag between the return rollers. Considering you have to do a track tension every day, usually, because you don't want your track to fall off, it can be very embarrassing. Yeah, this is not pleasant. The best way to show you how the bogie articulates is simply to come around behind it, and you can see the 3 pivot points for the various components. The first pivot point is for the lead bogie wheel, and that's on its own, the large one. The next pivot point is one on which the bogie arm for the last 2 vehicles is mounted, and that pivots up and down, so the last 2 will go up and down as a unit. And then the third pivot point is for the bogie rotation of those last 2 road wheels. So I figured it was a lot easier to show you than try to explain it, because if I explain it verbally, you probably still wouldn't understand it. And I would also like to note that I did not realize that this thing was on blocks before I got under here. Had I known that, I would have had a little bit more sense. Mounted up high is the point for the wire reel, and you'll see these on vehicles throughout the decades. In fact, the need for a wire to interconnect vehicles in Largo to provide secure, quiet, reliable communications that can't be triangulated upon and you don't need to speak in code never really went away until the end of the 20th century. Indeed, as a cavalry troop commander, I was still signing for these things in my property book as late as 2008. Although I have to say, I don't think they'd ever left the storeroom in decades before I got to them. Ample stowage is to be found on the right-hand side of the vehicle. The left-hand side is taken up a little bit by the exhaust pipe. The rear of the vehicle is fairly unremarkable. The tow hook will be mounted here on the leaf spring. Now, in a lot of vehicles, you're going to find little square rectangles on either side of the back. Those are smoke generators, and they're very well located for 2 reasons. A, they're right next to the engine to help generate the smoke, and B, they're actually between the vehicle and the enemy. So when it's time to pop smoke and go, you can really pop smoke and go. Other features on the back, well, the oil filler port and the dipstick will be located here. If you look down, you'll see 3 access ports for the transmission steering system. A little bit further forward on the right is a drain for the oil pan, and the gearbox access is a bottom center. Now, you're not going to see all these access ports on the back of a Valentine. They are unique to the Archer. Now, the powertrain has been nicked from this vehicle, probably to go repair a Valentine or something like that. But if it were there, and if I was able to show it to you, you would see that it was actually a pretty conventional design, with the exception again of the brakes being on the outside of the sprocket wheels. Right at the rear, you'd find the 2 radiators manufactured by the Coventry Radiator Company, and they're hinged to fold outwards and allow you to access the components underneath, such as the bevel box and the gearbox. A little bit further forward of that, you are going to find the General Motors 6-71M. It is an inline 6-cylinder diesel, 6.9 litres of displacement. And yes, it does use litres in the manual, and it's the other example of the confusion between metric and imperial in the manual. We've met it before in the twin diesel configuration on the M10. Here it puts out 192 horsepower and, being a diesel, good torque output of 552 foot-pounds, which will get the 16-ton vehicle along at 20 miles an hour. On the right-hand side of the engine, you're going to find 3 air cleaners, 2 6-volt batteries, 24-volt system, and 2 flame primers. Now what a flame primer is, it's a little burner that heats up the air that goes into the engine so you can start it up on a cold winter's day. On the other side, the left side, you can find the single fuel tank. It's 50 gallons, and this is enough to get the vehicle about 140 miles on the road, 75 miles off the road. That concludes the exterior tour of the Archer, and we'll be back in part 2 for the inside. I'll see you then. Welcome back to the Tank Museum Bovington and our tour of 17-pounder on self-propelled mounting Valentine, perhaps more commonly known as Archer. And as with most of the part 2s, we get to tour around the crew configuration of this rather unusual vehicle. Getting into Archer is really easy because it has no roof, and you've no idea how happy my camera crew are for the lighting and ability to hold the cameras. There was a roof mounted on later production versions. It was 8mm thick, it was on a little bit of a gap on 4 posts. It looked a lot like the late war roofs you'd find on American tank destroyers. That had 2 doors in the back which allowed you to get in and out. The manual says that this roof added 10 hundredweight to the weight of the vehicle. And I'm sure the interpreters are going to have lots of fun coming up with that one. Now, word of warning, the user handbook is wrong. I'm spending quite some time in here trying to figure out why the configuration of the vehicle, per logic, does not match with what's in the manual. The manual states that this is the commander's seat and that the loader seat is on the far side. Yeah, the wireless is on the far side and all the ammunition and the gun controls are on this side. So I'm going to bet that this is actually the loader seat. The seats would fold up out of the way, give you a little bit more room. Same with the commander's side. I will note that the loader is also responsible for the water. So there's a tank here and there's a little faucet down here that you can use to get your water out. Ammunition, this is the official ready bin, 10 rounds. Forward is 16 on the left, and then in an enclosed box there's an additional 13 on the right. The stowage for the SVDS was a little bit tricky. If you had SVDS, the later vehicles had a reversible plug that would support the round when you placed it down. Now, down beneath me here is a shell collector. This would, if it wasn't frozen in place, open up and collect the spent shell casings as they were used. A little bit further forward, this is the H travel lock, will swing up and interface with the base of the breech. There is a loader's safety switch here. It's a simple toggle, says off and on. And this is the electrical safety to prevent the gunner from accidentally discharging the weapon. There is also a manual safety on the back here, but it looks like it has been removed from the vehicle, as indeed have many parts of this vehicle, so this is going to be a surprisingly fast tour. 33 of the 39 stowage rounds could be fitted with those little stops for the SVDS ammo. There is additional stowage for 24 magazines for a Bren gun. Anyway, let's hop over the other side. The gunner's position would be here on a motorcycle type seat. It's adjustable forward and aft and up and down, and for road marches you can even spin it 180 so he's facing forward as the vehicle is driving along. To his front will be the controls. There are 2 types. There's obviously the manual elevation, and there's a lot of cranking for very little movement, and a manual traverse removed from the vehicle. However, to help him out, there's a push button on top of the manual traverse that activates a power assist, so points there. Its primary sight would be the number 51LC. It is a by 3, or would be if it was there, and also has an open sight for oh crap moments, where there's a blade. Basically, it's like a rifle sight with no magnification whatsoever, and it's just point and shoot. There would also be for indirect fire a dial sight here. Triggers, well, there's an electrical trigger on the handle and there's also a mechanical trigger by the foot. The gun, well, that's the Ordnance Quick Firing 17-pounder Mark II, which differs from the Mark I by being modified for vehicle use, primarily by removing the muzzle brake and adding a counterweight on the end. Well, eventually they decided to just put the muzzle brake back on anyway, and so I don't think there's actually any difference. Ammunition it'll fire, of course, famous for the armor-piercing capability. It is an anti-tank gun, and it will shoot APCBC at about 2,900 feet per second through steel plate 5.9 inches thick, sloped at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards. Very good, and it was actually reasonably accurate as well, serviceably so. If you really wanted more punch, there was eventually the aforementioned SVDS ammunition. That was basically a sabot, we would call it today. And that would punch through over 9 inches of armor if you could hit the target. And that was the problem with the sabot, is that they never actually fixed it from the 17-pounder. The British came up with a fix in 54 or 55. And the Canadians, well, they had their Pop sabot about 46, 47. But during the war, not known to be an accurate munition. Interestingly, the exact same projectile fired from a Comet's gun, no problems with accuracy at all. So make of that what you will. The last ammunition to arrive was a reduced charge high explosive, and this would fly much more slowly. It allowed you to better spot the tracer and fall of shot, which was always a problem with the 17-pounder because the tracer had a habit of falling off, and the muzzle blast was such that the obscuration would prevent you from seeing where your shot landed. So with the slower round, you can see where you're aiming. That's about it for here. I know I've asked you to use a little bit of imagination when viewing the gunner's position. I'm afraid I'm going to have to tax your imagination one more time as we go to the driver. The driver's position, well, again, use your imagination. His seat would be on a mount which would slide forwards and rearwards, but not adjustable in elevation. It is on top of the other two 6-volt batteries for the 24-volt system. And immediately lots of people will now pause, go check out the previous video, comments, and see how many people try to lay into me for saying 6 and 6 is 24. Haha. Now, it is often said, and even the museum plaque at the front of this vehicle, that you have to dismount the driver in order to fire the cannon, because of course the cannon's going to recoil. However, I don't see anything stating that in the manual, and looking at the cutaway view, I don't think that's true, because the recoil guard stops about here, and the driver's seat is about here. So you've got quite a few inches and a guard between your head and the recoiling breech. Now, sure, it's very disconcerting to have a ton of metal hurtling back towards your head at whatever speed the thing comes back at. But if everything's working, there should be no need for anybody to get out, as near as I can tell. Driving, well, that is done in a traditional Valentine type manner with the two tillers. The gearbox is located between the driver's legs in the traditional manner that the British kept going for years. It is a synchro mesh gearbox. However, the manual is very clear that you should double declutch anyway. Now, it is also very clear, because it uses block capitals, that you will learn to drive this vehicle better by experience than by reading this manual. It also states that we're not going to teach you in this manual how to double declutch or do anything else like that, because it is assumed that your instructors will have already taught you how to drive a regular vehicle before letting you loose in an armored vehicle, which is a rare amount of common sense in an army document. The manual does go into a fair amount of detail on the process for a hill start, and it seems obscurely complicated, requiring the use of both tillers, all 3 pedals, the gearbox, and a couple of additional pawls. So basically you have 7 or 8 controls that you have to use with 4 limbs, which I don't get it, but there you go. Starting this vehicle is probably the easiest you will ever come across. Step 1. Turn on master power, it's a switch on the left. Step 2. Press accelerator pedal. Step 3. Push starter button. Step 4. Profit. That's it. There's nothing else to it. If it is really cold, the controls for those flame primers I mentioned earlier will also be on the left-hand side to heat the air before it goes into the combustion chamber. Once he's on the move, of course, he's got to be able to see. I've already mentioned the lookout port here, but he also has the use of two No. 6 Mark I driver's periscopes, which again are not actually facing forward, which seems to be a little bit inconvenient to me. When he's done driving, all he has to do is stop, pull back on the tillers, lock them in place, hit the fuel shut off, you're done. And in here, I'm done. Production of the vehicle started in May of '44. Which meant that although it was supposed to be an interim vehicle to hold over until the arrival of more capable vehicles later, it was actually beaten into service by both the Challenger and the 17-pounder M10. Production continued until February of '45, at which point 665 vehicles had been delivered. It was typically used in troops of 3 batteries, each battery having 3 guns each. The troop commander had a Valentine Mark 11 command tank, and the battery commanders would have their own Valentine gun tanks. After the war, the vehicle trickled down and somehow found its way into Royal Armoured Corps service, and it was continued in use until 1950s. Compared to the M10, it was slower, probably less reliable, certainly more cramped, and less armoured. On the other hand, it was also a bit smaller and easier to conceal, so perhaps this suited it better in the anti-tank gun role. That's it for the tour of the Archer. Hope you found it interesting, and we'll see you on the next one.